All right, well, what if we start now? Okay, I've already introduced myself. Now that it matches that, I'm Howard Deiner. I'm a coach for a company called Solutions IQ back in the States. We're in Redmond. Though I really hate this tagline, right? Guiding the enterprise, the agile enterprise. Sheesh, what is that? From my perspective, what I do, it's like some of everything. Okay, we do weddings, we do bar mitzvahs, whatever is necessary, we can get that all. I live right outside of New York City. It's actually northern New Jersey, and you probably know all the Jersey jokes, so I'm not going to tempt you with that. Let's do this. Oh, that's the real slide. And this is what we're going to cover. I always start off these kind of presentations without giving the solutions, but talking about the problems first. Put everything into context. And my assertion is that Agile and Scrum, not bad, but they're not enough. So is anybody in this room not doing stuff like with Scrum? Probably everybody does Scrum nowadays, right? Yeah. Kanban, yeah. DSM. Oh yeah, that's DSM is a bigger thing out here, isn't it? Yeah, I forgot about that. Anyhow, there's a lot of people in the industry that do Agile, which means do Scrum, right? And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about process. All right, this isn't that kind of presentation. But the problem is that when people do Scrum, they usually do it really wrong. They leave silos in place. They leave silos in place for operations, which is kind of what I talked about yesterday. And they leave silos in place for things like testing, things like requirements, which we don't really have, in an Agile world, right? I should start this thing. But they leave those silos in place, and that leads to a lot of problems, right? Because we're always told, in an iterative environment, kind of like the message is always be ready to ship. Right. But we can't unless the code that we've developed is thoroughly tested so we can actually deploy it. Right? Because that's the real mark of whether we're successful or not just that we met the stories on some artificial backlog or a Kanban, kind of board. Those kind of things, those kind of metrics are gameable. Right? And anyhow, Scrum is not enough. Right? The real goal of development is, only touching on the actual coding nowadays. Right? In fact, many places, they feel that the real development aspect of it is a fungible commodity. Just get me 5 warm bodies. They call them things like FTEs, full-time. And if anybody says FTE to you, you should take whatever you're drinking and throw it at them. Right? Because teams have people on them, they have names, they should be bonding and identifying with one another, right? But the real goal of our development is to get the cycle time down so it can go from like a concept to cache in the quickest amount of time, right? It's part of the lean startup thinking, which is also very iterative, right? Lean startup thinking says things like get an idea, build some stuff around it, deploy it, get some metrics back, then make a decision of whether you want to pivot, try something else because the results you got back kind of weren't in the right direction. Persevere, which means, I think we can keep on doing it, we'll eventually reach the goals that we want. Or perish, like this is a dumb idea. But we've only wasted a little amount of time. But to do that stuff, you have to get real feedback. Not the artificial stuff that product owners look at, right? Anyhow, to get to shortening that cycle time, we have to change a whole bunch of things. It's not about process. We have to change the way, for example, we capture requirements. We have to change the way we go about testing, because we'll never get those cycle times down. Now, I'm not going to mention it here, but I'll mention it now, right? How many people in here ship code reliably every 3 months? within 3 months, are you shipping code? How many people ship code with, keep your hands up. So you guys take longer than 3 months? Should I start it with a year? Does anybody in here not ship within a year? Requires participation. How long does it take?
Half a year, okay.
Oh, half a year, okay. 3 months, okay, so people that, you code reliably tested. Wow. Every 2 weeks, it's released. It's going out to the public. Oh, hands went down. Okay, 2 weeks, not bad, not bad. You ever heard of a company called Facebook? They have a pretty big user base. How often do they release code? Anybody want to take a guess? It's shorter than 2 weeks.
Many times a day.
Every 90 minutes. Every 90 minutes. What they ship, right, are all the changes. They're small changes, but little things where they're going to try out an idea and see what kind of comes back. Kind of like A/B testing kind of idea. The stuff that they ship is an entire compiled PHP for their application. Right? It's a couple of gigabytes in size. When they ship, they have to load it onto CDNs across the world, right, to cut down on latency. That's not bad, every 90 minutes. You heard of a company called Amazon? You know how often they ship code?
11.6 seconds.
Pardon?
11.6 seconds.
Yes, you read the same thing. Yeah, 11.6 seconds, right, 5 times a minute. And they actually can burst into, 1,000 times a minute, something like that.
Is that code or content?
Well, is there a difference?
Yeah.
Really? It's all the executable bits and bytes and what the user sees. All right, if you look at it from an end user perspective, the stuff that they're shipping, most of that stuff, because they got tests. All right, and if you've never done this, it's really amusing, at least in the States. You get 2 people who don't have accounts, don't have Amazon Prime or basically an account with Amazon, and you get them to check a price on some item, some piece of electronics, let's say. And you're very likely to find they have 2 different prices. And even when you just have an Amazon account with somebody who isn't part of Amazon, you'll see 2 different prices come up, and it's not infrequent. They are testing their software. Now, if that is an A/B sort of a test to see how can we draw people in, okay, what will they tolerate? Oh, we noticed that this guy buys a luxury good, so we'll give him less of a discount. But they are doing this stuff 5 times a minute. That's pretty incredible. They actually don't use these techniques, but that's besides the point. Okay, goal of the software. So you're here to talk about Cucumber. You already know that it's a tool that can do acceptance test-driven development, BDD, stuff that does white box. You can do black box testing, right? A lot of the point that I'm going to make is that the reason to use Cucumber is that it can get us on the same page about what we're talking about. But I want to talk about 2 problems in requirements gathering first. The first one is called the curse of knowledge. Now, I'm going to tap out a song. This was, I should explain the experiment first. Back in, 1990, they did an experiment. Do you know this? Good. Because it ruins it if you do. Called the Tapper experiment. It was Elizabeth Newton who did this stuff. And what they had was a set of musicians and a set of listeners. Right? And the musicians would take a song, such as Happy Birthday, and they'd tap it out. Right? So I'm going to tap out Happy Birthday. Everybody got what that was. Right? I'm going to tap out another song. Okay? And tell me what it is. But it happens much less frequently, right? And the reason for it is the person that's tapping knows the song. It's playing in their head, right? There's always somebody that ruins it for me. They know it, they're singing along in their head. They can't imagine anybody not understanding it, right? So you ask the tappers who are doing it, you would ask them, well, how many people do you think are going to get it? And the answer was like, 50%. The observables were like 2% of the people got it, right? And it's a curse of knowledge, right? We can't recreate what we know because it's so obvious to us. All right. Now that affects us in the way that we're looking for people to tell us what they want. And I'll use the term product owners here, but the business, what do you want? And they say, we want a page that collects data about users so we can schedule the flights for them, and everybody says, oh yeah, I got it. Okay. And then they walk away. Right? The person requesting the information doesn't realize that there's other stuff that was unarticulated, but they expect as a requirement. Okay, so let me make up something for traveling. How about the simple thing of I'm leaving on this date and returning on this date, right? Pretty obvious that one date should be greater than the other. Right? We take that as and everybody in here would probably get that, right? So it's a pretty simplistic example. But there's lots of other stuff that goes on that's hidden that people that are on the business side can't imagine that anybody else wouldn't understand. Probably that's one of the reasons that when we hire people, we want them to have domain experience in addition to technical experience so that they pick up on what unarticulated stuff is out there. Doesn't work all that well, right? The truth of the matter is that if we're going to do development and have short cycle times, pardon me, that we've got to do better than that. Okay, we have to be a lot more precise when we're asking what we want. All right. Now, on developers, okay, and I don't mean to denigrate or anything, but developers don't like to test. Okay, developers like to write code. It's a lot more fun. It's something that you can really do and see, right? Developers don't like to test because it's boring. Okay, and the testing that I'm talking about is kind of the QA, exploratory, manual assertion testing. I'll run it through all these scenarios, and these are the kind of answers that I should get. I don't like doing that. Right? Pay QA people if that's what you want done. Right? Developers could do it. They wrote the code. They know how it should work, right? But they don't. So I want to, shorten that cycle time down. We're going to get there with automation, particularly automation with testing, and it makes developers happy because now we can write code. So in the long run, we're actually going to do better by automating those tests, by having developers write stuff that typically wouldn't be considered code. It's testing stuff, right? But we get a return on that because the quality of the software that we write is going to be better. It's going to meet the articulated and what used to be called unarticulated assumptions on what the requirements really are. And that's the whole premise. So, has anybody in here not seen this before at Qux.org? All right, if you haven't seen it, all right, this is what you get. It's the great granddaddy of what Cucumber development's all about. And it's pretty simple. There's actually 7 steps. First you design your behavior in plain text, if this is plain text, right? Talk about addition, talk about, I want to avoid silly mistakes. This is a cone template, my cone template, so it's a story. As a math idiot, I want to be told the sum of 2 numbers. Okay. Then we write this in a scenario, okay, and I want you to think later. There's a quiz in here about why this is a bad scenario, but take it as it is, all right? I've entered 50 into the calculator, I've entered 70 into the calculator. When I press add, then the results should be 120 on the calculator, hence the title of this talk. Right? You have to do one more thing with Cucumber. You have to write the step defs. Right? Those are the things that tie your plain text scenarios and features into the code itself. So we write a step def. This is all in Ruby. Right? We run it. We see it fail. Okay. TDD, we understand that. Get the red out. So you write some code. You run it again. It's yellow. We didn't have that one available yet. We fill that in, and look, it's all green. And of course, the most funny part about this is repeat steps 1 through 6 until the money runs out. Well, so we get ready. We say, this is it. We understand now what to do. By the way, you can stop me at any point in here, or else I'll just keep on rattling on. So if any of the pictures look enigmatic, WTF, Howard, what's that all about? Or you disagree, please stop me. Anyhow, I'm going to assume that, we're doing Java development, right? And a great tool for that is Cucumber JVM. So we got there and download it. We write, the same kind of test in Cucumber, show it to our boss. Boss says, wow, this is great. This is wonderful. So what do? Say, this is going to work. What could possibly go wrong? We start writing tests. We start writing lots of tests, right? And then things really go wrong. And one of the biggest things that goes wrong is we think of Cucumber as a testing environment. And the more tests we put together, the better we must be doing. It shows we're productive, we're working, we're doing this stuff. We're forgetting about the fact that the real goal is not writing tests, but it's the quality of the code, right? So we'll talk about that. But first, I want to go through some misconceptions. And the first most glaring misconception is about how easy Cucumber is. Now, what you're looking at here is an Argentum projectile, also known as a silver bullet. Right? Oh, you actually need to see the real slide. Okay. There was this guy, you probably know him. Well, let me hold off on that. The training that we give our BAs is we say, take all of your requirements, put given, when, and then in them, and then hand them off to developers, and they'll make all of those requirements into workable tests. It's that simple, right? And I've literally seen this done. I mean, the examples I'll show later come from, or examples I could also show you. I'll see what the time is. Come from a company in the States called Vonage. Oops, now it's out. And they needed to do some Cucumber work, and they decided we need to get stuff written in Cucumber. Basic reason that they wanted to do acceptance level testing, right? This was Selenium testing within Cucumber, was that their applications were like way out of control. They had never done unit testing on them. They were fragile. Their releases were really difficult. So they said, okay, automated testing is the way to go. So, okay, let's go do that. And they put it all on a schedule. And they took all of their BAs and they said, write down what the test should be. So they'd come back with these terribly articulated things that talked about, they basically had given, whens, and thens in them. Really was not very helpful. All right. Well, Cucumber isn't that magic bullet, right? And the reason that the things are failing is that we haven't gotten out of the silos. All right, we got one group that's writing tests. Let's measure how fast they write tests. We have one group that's trying to code these tests, the developers. Okay, let's see how fast they're doing it. And then one group that's actually looking at the results, the QA people, sitting in their silo saying, well, that's not working, that's not working. You forgot about this stuff over here. Very ineffective. Even if it's very efficient within each of the silos. So to fix that, we need the Three Amigos, right? Probably nobody ever saw this movie. You did, okay, it's clever, right? It's not those three amigos that we need. The three amigos that we really need to do this work with are business BA types of people that really like writing requirements. They understand, they can translate the stuff from the business needs into requirements. More about that in a second. We need developers who can understand that the things that are being written are things that make sense, things that they can actually construct code around. Then we need QA people. The QA people have a different kind of a role. Their role, okay, which they're usually pretty good at, is to make sure that edge cases are covered, to make sure that stuff isn't forgotten about, right? And so you put these three kind of people together, and they start talking. And one of the things they start talking in is a domain-specific language, the language of the business that's doing this project, all right? So having the silos is a bad thing. Having the actual three amigos is a good thing. So again, misconception that it's all done in silos. All right. Better testing is the goal. Another misconception, right? People assume, right, that testing was the goal, right, and they focus on how much testing is going on. Gaming, okay, if testing is what you're going to pay me for, I'll make sure I give you plenty of tests, right? The first software product that I worked on was a horribly complicated piece of engineering software for finite element analysis called Patran. And we had lots of quality issues. Oh my God, even getting to release. So we would pay people, the testers, $100 a piece to find bugs. Our defect rate went way up. I mean, that was one of the worst decisions the company ever made, right? Because that's what they were paid for, so they'll do that. Right? I mean, and so you got to be careful what you're asking for, right? The real problem, okay, is to understand the stuff that we're doing before we start doing it, right? So that's going to involve talking to one another in a domain language that makes sense. When I get to the 12 steps, or actually 13 steps, we'll talk about that a bunch. But it's the work of the three amigos that really helps redefine what goes on, right? Cucumber isn't so much of a testing framework as it is a communications framework. Okay? Now, it's kind of neat, and you'll see the reason for this in a bit. Cucumber can keep us, the actual tool itself can keep us from solutioning too early. Right? It's not unexpected, okay, that developers come out and they say, oh, we understand what you need. No problem. We got this. Right? And they go off and do something. Sometimes it's correct. Most of the time it's not. Right? They didn't understand all the requirements of this stuff. But what I hate even worse are the business people that come in and say, I know what you need. I know how to do this. Let me write your stories. I say, great, write the stories. And then they start writing stories like, as a product owner, I need a publishing tool that will do all the stuff that I need because it'll make the company money. And all the stories start looking like that. Right? What do you mean a publishing component? Oh, it's got to have these kind of things on it. Why? Right? It's always why. So we start the solutioning process on the business side. Usually, the business doesn't really know, right? It's, in fact, if you look at it more generally, Agile and Scrum is actually not a very good process for making a project run faster, okay? Agile and Scrum is much more about problem solving, right? That's the iterative part of it. Not just the incremental, I got some stuff and I'll deploy that, I got some more stuff, I'll deploy that. It's not about, it's meant for problem solving, not for producing stuff on a schedule. Anyhow, so when you use Cucumber and you use it correctly, you'll find that product people are going to give you the whats. They're going to give you the whys, right? But they kind of get inhibited. They really can't say hows if you do the Cucumber stuff more correctly. So the story behind this has to do with an F-16 founded in this book called 97 Things Every Software Architect Should Know. There was a story in there about a guy named Harry Hill-Laker, right, who was a lead designer of the F-16, right? So he's going to write requirements. One of his requirements is, I need a plane that can go Mach 2 to Mach 2.5. Really? Somebody on the company that, who did this plane? Lockheed, came back to him and said, why Mach 2 or Mach 2.5? And his answer was, oh, well, we got to be able to, get ourselves out of trouble and escape from combat. Oh, that's the problem. So the engineers went back and said, Mach 2 or Mach 2.5 has nothing to do with it. It's all about thrust to weight ratio, the ability to be, to make sharp turns. I mean, that's why the F-16, they can get up to like 9 Gs. They can pull a turn on those things to avoid enemies, right? But the plane isn't that fast. It definitely isn't a Mach 2 plane. Solutioning too early. Don't say how to do it. First start with what you need and why you need it. All right, so with that out of the way, we can start talking about the baker's dozen. Right, I know there was advertised as 12 things, but gee, let's give you full value here. First thing to talk about is you got to make sure that you're communicative. Right? It's not just using given whens and thens, right, in some, what I'm calling an unstructured narrative. Right? So here's an example of a requirement, right? And this is where I wanted to bring in Fred Brooks, okay, who was the guy that talked about the mythical man month. That fellow, you can't produce a baby in 1 month using 9 women. Right? If you take more developers and add them to a late project, you're going to make it later. Yes? Good. If you haven't read the book, you should. It's still relevant. Right? Anyhow, we're going to have a requirement, and it nicely put in a Mike Cohn template. Right? As a dashboard user, I want a status message updated at regular intervals of not less than every 60 seconds, so I can quickly understand if there are system issues I need to be aware of. Okay, well, that's not a Cucumber way of writing it. Write it for Cucumber. So they say, okay, given I'm a dashboard user, when a regular interval of no less than 60 seconds occurs, then I want an updated status message. Good gherkin. That's the proper way to write it. Kind of sucks, though, as a requirement, right? Because when the three amigos get a hold of this, they start talking about some of the issues. Like, what's a dashboard user? Exactly who is that? Why are they different from other people in the world, right? What do you mean by status message? Okay, you mean things that you monitor? Tell me more about it. And that thing about not less than 60 seconds, right? Could we poll every 10 years? Oh, no. It's not more than 60 seconds. Oh, well, why didn't you say that? Right? How about polling every 10 nanoseconds? No, I don't want that either. You really want 60 seconds. Got it. After talking stuff through, they can come out with a much more communicative requirement that actually isn't bad as a nice Cucumber feature, right? So this is in an outline form. Okay, this isn't really a class. I'm trying to teach you all the ways to do Cucumber, but this is part of a feature, right? Given that I authenticate as a system monitor user, notice the change in terminology, then I should be presented with a system monitor dashboard. Oh, that's different. Where did this dashboard concept come from? Fact that it's not just messages flying out into the ether. Right? It's not just some wild SMS, whatever. They're talking about a dashboard. When, and here's some examples, when 60 seconds has elapsed and a nothing has produced an non-event, then I should see a system nominal in the alert area of the dashboard. Right? And talking about it, people said, oh, well, when there's like out-of-memory things, we should know about that much more quickly. How about 10 seconds? Right? And then different roles. Right? Let's monitor the online order system. And the event said, oh, your system crashed. Oh, we got this other thing with, with inventory system. It gets overloaded. All right, well, define what overloaded means. That means there's more than 10 user loads on it. Got it. Okay. Every 10 seconds, I want to make sure the inventory system isn't, giving me a message of saying overloaded. And should it do that, I want it to come back and say, you've exceeded 10 user loads. These are the things that come out once we have that discussion. Much more rich than that. Right? They're both valid gherkins. Okay, but this one is much more precise. So what happens is developers, if they aren't given the opportunity to discuss this stuff, the point of no return is when we actually start coding. Right? As developers, we start coding, and we get it wrong, and then a cycle comes back, and we have to have meetings about what are we really supposed to do, what did you do, whose problem is that, right? Both the developers and the testers are people that don't understand who the business person is, right? We don't want that wasteful reworking of things to occur, okay? And if you're thinking that it's going to cost more money to put that kind of testing, executable requirements basically in place, well, you're right. You're right, it is going to cost more money. But what's the value in not having to rework things? Right? What's the value in not having all those meetings? Right? And I think that when you start talking about that, you'll understand that there is real value in doing it that kind of way. Right? So the first thing about it is be communicative. Second thing to work on, and I'm sorry that I don't have pictures in here, but when I started putting this stuff together, I want to make sure that you had enough information to take back with you. And then it would have been like 300 slides. So I said, let's just put it in there. But there's a treat at the end. Second thing to be working on is that domain-specific language. Right? We have to understand what we're talking about. And as you go through this stuff, it evolves. So we got to make sure that everybody can understand what everybody is saying. Right? Otherwise, we're going to write the wrong kind of tests. That's going to mean that the business stakeholders have to collaborate more. Now, I know we try to do this in Scrum. Right? I mean, guys are familiar with Scrum, and even if you're doing Kanban, probably have a similar sort of thing, where there's some sort of a planning mode that takes place. Before we start working on a story, we're supposed to meet with the product owner or business people, face-to-face when possible, or video if not, and ask them questions, ask them anything. Right? But if we do that, and we only do it like once a day, okay, you're not getting the kind of interchange that you really need to be highly communicative, right? So you get better at it when you are able to start writing sentences with the nouns and verbs that are part of that ubiquitous language. So we just say it and everybody knows what it means, and we don't have to go back and draw stuff on the board or try to remember from some verbal history what we meant by this or that. Right? So that ubiquitous language is important. Right? It's going to evolve over time. So I'm going to give you an example of what that means. Right? But the words that we start using as we discuss it, as new things come up, say, well, what do we mean by that? How's that occurring? right? So if you noticed on the original example, talked about a dashboard user. As the three amigos discussed it and tried to put together an outline of the real tests that have to get run, they understood that that was kind of like a system monitor user who probably authenticates. Proof is in another feature that came up, authentication. All right. There might be other users of that system that don't need to authenticate. Maybe these are the ones, right, that they got the messages automatically. Maybe the system monitor was actually able to go out there and kill jobs or whatever. Right. But we're fleshing out that stuff in our Gherkin tests. Okay, the Gherkin tests are written in a domain-specific language, right, so that we can model the world that we're trying to work in. Okay, domain-specific languages. What is this? Number 3, declarative and not imperative. Who knows declarative versus imperative? Okay, well, I'm going to tell you a couple of things that come out of that. I know that this is important. And you'll see that it's especially important when we start talking about tying Cucumber with Selenium, okay, but in a different kind of a context. So there's 2 basic kinds of sentences in at least the English language. There are communicative sentences and informative sentences, right? The communicative ones are said for the speaker's sake, right? And they're probably the more primitive part of our language, right? They consist of 2 types of expressions. Things that are exclamatory, such as, ouch, right? Things that, children, that's the first kind of things that they start learning, in addition to who's mommy and who's daddy, right? Then there's imperative, which are important for us, okay? So an example of an imperative sentence is, after separating the yolks from the whites, beat the whites until they have firm peaks. Steps. Do this, then do this, then do this next thing. Right? Now, we don't need the exclamatory stuff in our Cucumber tests. But we do recognize imperative. On the informative side, the sentences that are there are for mutual benefit between both the listener and the speaker. Okay? And they form 2 sorts of subcategories. The first ones are interrogative, right? Who are you? What do you want? Again, those are not the sorts of things that we use inside of Cucumber. Those are the sorts of things that we do to come up with our declarative sort of sentences. Okay, and the secret there is, here's the declarative sentence. Roses are red, violets are blue. Doesn't tell us how to go about doing this, doesn't say even what the steps are. Perhaps this is part of a ritual with your mate. I don't know. Okay? But it says some stuff that both the person listening to it gets, right, that there's some sort of a concept that we're talking about. And it's something from the speaker's standpoint they benefit from, because they've gotten to encapsulate the things that they're actually asking for in a nice way, even if they don't know the steps involved in making it happen. So here's what imperative sounds like, right? This is perhaps could be put into a Gherkin format, right? Go to the logon page, enter the user ID in the field labeled user, enter the password in the field labeled password, press the button labeled OK, and see if we land on the page titled Order Entry. If that occurs, then we have a valid user for entering orders. The steps involved are extremely clear. Right? We really know what's going on with this. The one thing that we didn't capture, okay, was the declarative part of like, these are steps for authenticating users. Right? Really bad consequences occur. Right? Perhaps the field, presumably on a screen, might change from user to user ID. Oops, all the things that mentioned user are now invalid. Perhaps there's another way of authenticating, right, where maybe I'm making an iOS app. We start off using user ID and password. We got away with it when we talked about two-factor authentication, but then they wanted to do biometrics. They wanted us a thumbprint. How does that work? The concept of authentication, though, still remains, right? It's implemented differently. So, we're pretty clear about what it is that we want. We don't particularly care how you get there, only that it's correct, right? So, a declaration type of thing. For declaration, I decided not to put in a cucumber test, but to put in something else that we probably all have used, which is a SQL statement. Right? So this is a SQL statement. We kind of know from, that this is a join, right? Select a customer name and order ID from the customer and order tables, where the customer ID equals the customer ID from the order table, right? We are not telling the database how to go about doing that. You can do it in many, many different ways, right? High-performance databases probably take stuff that's been cached and hash things to get values very quickly. The database may decide, I have to read everything, and I'll read down all the customer stuff from the customer table, then read in every row from the order table and do a match on that, or the other way around. We basically don't know, and we basically don't care, as long as we get back the results that we're expecting in a reasonable amount of time. Right? Which says that we should be declaring what our intentions are. Now, interestingly, declaring intentions is exactly the words that air traffic control will ask from pilots. Right? I happen to be a pilot, private pilot, and you go to an airport and you say your tail number and kind of like where you are. And usually what the air traffic control person would say is declare intention. What they're asking for is, what are you really asking? Why are you calling me? Right? Are you asking for a transit sort of way? I want to fly over your airspace. Are you looking to land? Right? Even when you ask to land, you won't say what runway. You might say a preference for a runway, but it's up to ATC to decide based on all the planes that are out there, what the best use of their airspace is. Right? So in a Gherkin world, going back to authentication, we want to authenticate the user and verify that they have an order entry permission. Right? We don't care about those gruesome parts of how you're going to do it, because you can do it many, many, many different ways. Those are further discussions that you're going to have. Right? Bottom line is that using a declarative format will make your test less brittle. Right? And less brittle and more intention evident. Right? And they're all part of the stuff that we did with that domain-specific language. Number 4, write repeatable tests. Never assume that you have a particular back-end state. This isn't easy. This is one of those harder ones. So there's a story that goes with this, which probably took place about 15 years ago with a guy who was working for a financial services firm. They have a concept of wash sales in the United States, where if you buy a security after you've sold one within like 30 days, then they treat it as a short-term sale, which means more taxes than if you otherwise did it, right? So the financial services firm was trying to warn people, oh, you're about to commit a wash sale, okay, when you sell this thing and buy the other one. So is that what you want? This guy was a mainframe programmer, and he's so proud, okay, because I've been speaking to him for months about putting together repeatable unit tests. Okay, so he came back to me one morning and said, wow, I did it. Finally got it. I got to show you this. And he shows me he has a JUnit test that runs all of his things. I said, wow, that's great. So could you run it now? Let me see what you did. And his answer was, well, I ran it yesterday. I can't really run it right now. I got to go take a look at the test bank and see where wash sales might occur. Then I'll know what test to put in to verify that they happened. Like, wow, what happens if you do the test today and then run them, tomorrow? And I said, yeah, there's no problem with that. I just have to look through the database and see what the state is like, and then I'll know what tests to write, and they'll pass. You basically have to poke around in the database first. Well, that's completely unacceptable. He did the right thing in terms of he wrote it in JUnit. Big deal. It wasn't repeatable. Manual assertions. Right? Now, if we've written stuff with JUnit before, and we're used to doing some form of a small integration test, the trick that we normally do is in our before annotation, we'll say, before you run this test, start a transaction, right? Then you'll run your test, and then in the after hook, you'll come back and say, oh, don't commit that transaction, clear it out. And that works wonderfully. It's a really nice way to, work it in, small integration tests inside of JUnit. That's not going to work in Cucumber, right? And in fact, I shouldn't say that. That won't work with Cucumber that are tied to presentation types of testing. Okay? And the reason for that is that the process that is running the browser is out of your process, right? So he's not the one, you are not the person that's controlling the transaction. Somebody else that's doing it, right? They could be another process on your machine. They could be a process on a remote machine. You don't have control over the transaction anymore. So that little trick doesn't work. Okay, but you can still do it, okay, kind of more brute force with befores and afters. You basically have to make sure in your before state that whatever database state you need is set. Whatever junk is in the database that will cause your test to fail, you've got to take out. All right, make sure the database is committed, run the test, and then in the after part, in the after hook, remove any other debris that's been laying around. And that is kind of ugly, I admit, but that's like a way to go do it, right? The better way, of course, is to write them as small unit tests so you don't have to run the full integrated stack. But eventually you will have to run it, right, before you release. So anyhow, we can do it. Kind of looks ugly. What you're looking for, the reason we do it is that we want to make sure that if a test fails, it fails for the right reason, right? And the wrong reason is that the database state wasn't present. You're not going to figure that out until you go in and debug. And some of those debugging things are not going to be repeatable, right? Because it's going to depend on what tests were run before, perhaps. So we don't want to be in those situations. We want to make sure that each and every time we run the test, it's going to produce exactly the same results every time. And that'll take some work. Not as bad as some of the other work that we have to do. All right, this is an easy one, tags. I should have asked this before. Who uses Cucumber around here? Oh, good. What environment?
So we use SpecFlow, which is the .NET.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So these things are built around Java stuff. So SpecFlow is slightly different annotation, same basic concept. You also in .NET?
No,
Java. Okay, then you can read these things directly. There are a number of them, and there's, Ruby stuff is also slightly different. Same general idea. Tags, right, are something that you can pretty much use all over the place, right? You can tag with an @ sign features and scenarios. Why would you want to tag them, you say? Well, it gives us the ability to start parsing out which tests are which. We've got a big corpus of tests, but we don't want all of them to run all the time. Perhaps we want to run just the small little tests that aren't fully integrated, more of like unit tests, every time we check in code. We may want to run a scheduled task that does testing overnight, right? And we want to be able to parallelize them, right? And say these sort of tests are going to go on that kind of an environment, these set of tests are going to go on that environment. Using the right kind of continuous integration tool, you can have them run in parallel. Right? And it also forms a sort of documentation. Okay, what these tests that all have the same tag are all about. All right. The way that you work with tags, and this is applicable, and in spec flow it's a little bit different. Okay, but there basically is going to be a runs with annotation that says what the test runner is that Cucumber is going to use, or spec flow. Right? And inside of Cucumber JVM, there's this Cucumber options thing. And this is where I'd have to check with spec flow to see exactly what's going to happen next. But with the options, you're able to use the tags, use tildes for nots, okay, and actually and or conditions together, right? So anything within the quotes inside the curly braces, and many of those quoted expressions, all of the things will be anded together. So this is saying, run all the tests that are not browser or long running. Okay, those probably are those short tests. If you have several expressions in quotes, they mean oring. So kind of like the inverse. Run all the browser things that are also long running. Or are long running. Thank you. And you can combine them together, right? So you can have anding and oring. So it's a general purpose sort of a way to filter based on tags. Tagging. Coming up on the halfway point. Making sure that your test suites can run on all the environments. Right? Now, this is kind of like repeatability, okay, but it's like a superclass of repeatability. It's not just about the tests running repeatably every time we do them, but that the tests run repeatably on the CI server, in the QA environment, even in the pre-production environments, we're running smoke tests. Okay, we want to make sure that it's environment invariant, right? Normally, we do this, by setting properties and using dependency injection. Stop me if those words are not good. Okay? And we want to keep all of that stuff, of course, abstracted away from Cucumber. So anytime you start seeing code, including your test code, and they're trying to test environmental stuff, right? You got to say, this is wrong. This is the wrong place to do it, right? That's something that you do in the build scripts. That's something where you're writing out property files to run in that environment. You shouldn't have to see this stuff inside the actual code. Okay, so make sure that that's all abstracted away. This is also, of course, the way, and we're about to get into this, that will enable stuff with Selenium, right? Who in here is interested in Selenium and doing testing most? It's become a very popular environment for that. Okay, so when you're talking about where do I want this browser to run and what kind of a browser do I want to run, maybe even what kind of a browser on a particular operating system to run, you don't do it inside the code. So let's talk about Selenium. Woo! Yes, we are going to talk about it. This will be the hardest section, okay? But, so bear with me. Talked about this a little bit before. Declarative form is really important with Selenium. I'm not going to go too deep into Selenium. It's not a course in Selenium, right? But we don't want tests that include things that are going to change. A common kind of problem, and we'll talk about this because probably you guys that have been doing it have this problem. Many of the dynamic JavaScript environments, will come out and give you something that the only way to get at the element that you're looking for is to use an XPath, right? And those things will change over time. That's not the right way to go about it. You don't want to have even IDs, okay, that are present. And when I say they're present, if you're using a declarative form but you have the step defs, looking at particular IDs or XPaths, you're doing it wrong, right? So what you should be working with are page objects. Anybody in here working with page objects yet? Good. Yeah. This is definitely the way to go. Page objects, right, are kind of a service level abstraction that relate very well to declarative form stuff. Right? So a page object understands that, I'm looking for some sort of authentication from this particular page. Implemented, it'll actually have in one place all the gruesome details of how to access that field. all the gruesome details of what it takes to do a particular action, all the things that are really the imperative form, but they're in one place. So should that change, you don't have to use shotgun surgery to go find all the places that that XPath is sitting inside, right? So declarative form is like really, really important if you're going to do stuff that's based with Selenium. The other hard problem, and this is a much harder problem, is the synchronization problem, right? So, as I said before, when you're testing with Selenium, you're dealing with an out-of-process thing, right, that you can't control. And, write linear code, you say, right over here, I need a response. Here, web server, get me this page, and your next statement says, like, I'm asking it some attributes about the page. You run that code, you realize, oh, my code is executing a lot faster than the code on the web server, right? Now, what people, the first time they do this, they say, oh, I gotta wait. Oh, yeah, how do you wait? Oh, thread.sleep, Java, right? If you use thread.sleep, I'm gonna have to hurt you, right? You do not wanna use that, because you'll find that it fails in two sorts of ways. One way that it fails is that whatever time you put down there, it runs a little bit longer than that, okay? And you find that the stuff is timing out, and then you say, well, and then you run it again and it works, and that's too many errors that occur because you know the time. Or it times out and you say, oh, let's double it, right? Then you definitely see the other problem, which is that your test suite can only run as fast as all of your sleep states. Okay, so it just gets worse and worse and worse. Many times the browser is really running, so you don't want to use that. Those are two really bad outcomes. So if you are not using fluent waits, you're doing it wrong. The alternative to fluent waits is using the event firing WebDriver. Does anybody do that? It's really hard to write. Okay, you're basically doing event-driven programming. Okay, which makes the implementations look messy. And many times the people that write the code that does this testing, are not people that are familiar with event-driven programming, which is harder. It's harder by an order or two of magnitude, right? So instead of that, fluent wait gives you a way to keep your code linear. It will have two parameters that you can specify if you want. One of them is the, what do they call it? It's basically the thread.sleep time. It's the total time until a timeout. Okay? And then the other parameter is the polling parameter. So I might want to say, I'm waiting for something to happen, which is the expected condition stuff. I want something to occur in the DOM. Check for it every 50 milliseconds, okay? And it will poll. It'll hold your test code and poll every 50 milliseconds. And then as soon as that thing occurs, your code continues, which means that you are now running at the browser speed rather than waiting on each and every thread.sleep time, right? And there's a whole number of things that you can do in those expected conditions, right? You can do stuff to see if an element is visible yet. You can see if an alert's come up. You can see if an element is clickable. You can wait for particular frames, all kinds of very rich, right? And it works well either with the browser and the back-end server just being slow, or it works really well with any kind of asynchronous HTTP that you might have, with dynamic JavaScript. Okay, you don't care. You're actually running in a real driver. Problem, of course, is that many people actually would like this to run headless, right? And your choice is like HTML driver, which isn't going to run the JavaScript real well. So the way I look at it, if you really want testing and presentation layer testing, and you're going to do it once a day, do it on real machines, spread the load out and get it over with. Eventually has to get done. Stuff about Selenium. Stuff about refactoring, right? Your tests that you write even just the Gherkin stuff, it's really code, right? But you start finding, and this was something that came up, I think you were at a spec flow thing that I did about 2 years ago.
Me?
No, the guy behind you.
Oh.
Were you there? Did it at Software Architect. Or maybe, were you there?
I might have been.
You might have been. Anyhow, one of the guys in the audience asked, he said, we start writing tests and like they're all over the place, right? So they do get out of hand, and they are kind of a technical debt that you're going to work with. So an example that I'm giving is you're able to handle it better if you continue to keep the flow going with the DSL. Okay, so we might have started talking about patients, and then we start writing more stuff, and we realize there's Medicare patients written for a US audience. Yeah, why would you do that? Then we start realizing there's patients and Affordable Care Act patients, so-called Obamacare, which I hate that word. And eventually you start realizing that these things can form together, okay, and your tests get smaller. You're also going to have to keep a taxonomy, much like you do in code, right? We don't put stuff all in like a default package. You know, we have a method to how things flow out. You're going to need the same sort of thing with your test there, right? But it's the three amigos that can kind of understand this, particularly the developers when they're looking at this stuff, are thinking in terms of, you know, data abstractions and the hierarchies involved. So that's the best way to kind of make this stuff work. You don't want to skimp on doing this refactoring because they're just tests. It's code. It deserves to have high quality. Maybe not as high quality as, you know, the C++ driver that you wrote for this thing, but still quality.
Can I just ask, you keep mentioning Gherkin, and just in a sentence, what is Gherkin?
I'm sorry, yeah. Gherkin is the language, if you will, of Cucumber. So the primary way that you notice it is, you know, you start off with features, right? And features are kind of like a user story, you know, in Scrum terms. And then there'll be scenarios, okay? And each of those scenarios are the things that are tested. The one that I showed you had a scenario written in an outline form. So Gherkin is like a really super simple language with those things that say given, when, then, and, not, but, a couple of keywords. And you find out that most of the implementations don't even care. You can put asterisk inside of it, and it works just as well. Okay, but they are the thing that then allows a regular expression parser to see where you can take pieces out of it and then assign them to parameters so that now in the step defs, you can tie the code, if you will, that people write out in plain text and make it into stuff that you can exercise the system with. Does that make sense? Yep, okay. Sorry about that. Your feature file should start with a happy path. Right? You want to avoid big requirements. Right? This is something that we used to be taught. Go in there and drive out all the requirements. Get them all into tests. Bad idea. Right? It's bad because it doesn't get the grip of where TDD and BDD have been going for over a decade. Right? You're going to miss at least 4 different things if you don't do happy paths. So happy paths allow you to do that validation of business value. The thing I was talking about with lean startup. I can very quickly see for the normal case, can I show that it's working? For the normal case, is that something that's good? Is in the normal case, should I persevere and keep on working through it? Right? It also allows people to start to iterate and say, well, for this next little scenario, what's it worth to you, product owner? You know, it's going to be a real tough one to implement. It might take 2 iterations to do it. You know, does that make sense to you? Right? So if it doesn't make sense, let's not spend a lot of time going through it. Right? So it gets into that iterative part. It also will allow us to find the real alternatives and exceptions, right? Because we're playing with the software that's working already. When we think about it abstractly in the old sense of the big requirements up front, miss them. We kind of like how to add them in at the end, right? It also gives us the ability when we're not saying just do all these requirements, to go back to the agile concept of, I got enough in there, I want it shipped. Business people can now make that decision, and then later on we can always take on new alternatives and exceptions, right? And of course, as you do them, make sure that you're still writing the test first, not just writing a whole bunch of code. This, I kind of said this already, but there's more. Feature files are not something that you just keep someplace, right? They belong with the code. In the same way that databases belong with the code, but that was yesterday, okay? They are part of a particular version of a particular set of features that the code implements, right? You want to be able to use that repository and say, well, we got to roll back, which means that the current set of features are not going to run. It might be new things that you put into it. So you've got to be able to check in this stuff in a proper way to work with your CI system, right? Because that's how we're going to get to continuous delivery. You have to make sure that whatever version of the software we're trying to validate and ship, automated testing shows that it's possible to do that, right? And it's one leg of technical excellence, right? This becomes executable requirements if you can do that, right? We have to be able to rapidly go back after we implement something and make sure that there are no untoward side effects, that everything still works, right? And you're not going to be able to get there if you're not sure which files belong with which others. Oh, here's the part. So, I'm going to try to tell you what this is, but since I can't really just say it, I'd like to sing it. It would really help if you could sing with me. Okay? Everybody knows John Lennon. Everybody remembers there was an album back in 1971 that he wrote called Imagine. And the words would go something like, imagine there's no requirements. It isn't hard to do. I'm doing this like William Shatner. Nothing to debug and cry for, and no wasteful meetings to bump, 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 bump. Imagine all the business using executable requirements, living life in peace. You may say, there we go. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Hope someday you will join us, and the workplace will be fun. No, please don't. Enough of that. Never let the sun set on a failing test, right? We have to make sure that our builds are clean, and that if something happens, right, if we're not constantly testing, that we don't build up some debt associated with it. Okay, we need evidence that the code base is still really working, right, because that's the thing that you're presuming. So you have to run that experiment of running the tests against it to see if that is still valid, right? There's no way to prove correctness, but you can prove your hypothesis that the code is still working with all your tests. Adding a new test, does that make the hypothesis fail, right? So when we're doing this, we've got to constantly be looking at that stuff because of the remediation cost. Right, I'll do it quickly. Those of you that have seen this before, I apologize in advance. My first product, this complicated computer-aided engineering front-end element analysis product. And it's used to build bridges and put earthquakes under them and see if the bridges will collapse. Or you make a model of a car and smash it into a concrete wall and see if it kills the passengers. So it actually saves a lot of money because you're able to model things that you otherwise would have to do in reality. So this was a terribly complicated project, right? There was 100 people that were working for me. We had 8 million lines of KNRC code. Bad. We had all those defects I was talking about, $100 a pop. Anyhow, one day I was in the men's room, and there's an unspoken etiquette, if you don't know about this yet. When men go to the men's room and they're standing, normally want a space between each person. It's just unspoken. This is what guys do, right? It's kind of impolite to stand next to somebody. So who stands next to me? It was like empty. Lou Delmonico, the CEO of the company. And then there's another rule, which is that you don't talk to the person. And what does Lou do? He starts talking to me. And he says, hey, Howard, how are things going? Great, Lou. Just wonderful until you came in. You know, and a little chit-chat, and I'm trying to get out of there. Quickly wash my hands, go into the hall. Lou's following me down the hall. Says, whoa, wait up, I got something important for you. Sure, Lou. Okay, what do you got to say? And then he says, somebody throw me a marker. Somebody goes and throws him a marker, a permanent marker. Lou goes to the wall, it was a white wall, and he draws this on the wall. And I say, Lou, you are drawing on the wall. And he says to me, well, Howard, you know how much money I'm spending on your stupid project that you're not shipping yet? A gallon of paint is only going to cost me 15 bucks. I can fix that. He says, this is important. Listen up. Okay, go ahead. Lou says, imagine that our product was being used to build cars. And an engineer is building a car with disc brakes. And he draws a disc brake, and he draws in 8 inches, you know, for the disc size. And they go and they manufacture the car, and they sell the car, and there's millions of cars on the road. But because 8 inches wasn't really enough braking capacity on the car, cars are smashing into one another on the highways. The brakes are overheating, people are dying, got lawsuits, a tremendous amount of cost has occurred at that point. We don't want that. By using our product, they'll be able to test earlier. Ooh, kind of like our test first stuff. So imagine if they were able to catch the defect that the disc brake was too small before they started shipping millions of them out there and selling them. Okay, before they got final assembly all done. We save some money with that. Imagine, 5-minute warning. Imagine if, we got 15 minutes. Imagine if we were able to catch that defect in the engineering parking lot where they build one car, and they really do this. I used to work for General Motors for a while. One car by hand, and they kind of like drive it around the parking lot, literally to see if like the wheels fall off or something nasty. Right? So if we found out the disc brakes were no good then, it wouldn't cost us too much to fix it. We've only built one car. He said, now imagine using Patran that the engineer, as he draws his circle of 8 inches, the machine comes back and says, whoa, too small, go to 10 inches. So the defect costs us nothing to fix at that point. Right? And that's where we want to drive towards. Right? So test first development, is very important because over time, defects get more costly to fix. Make sense? I can thank Lou for that. Okay. The cucumber tests that you put together are a form of a documentation, right? It allows us to understand what the code does. It allows us also this side benefit of testing, right? So we know what we asked for. We see that we got what we wanted, right? I have a technique that I like working with when I do Selenium stuff, which says after each update to the screen, I capture a screen image, okay? And doing that allows me to make like a screencast. Okay, you just put it, make it an animated GIF, right? And those are actually kind of cool for people that do, the acceptance testing, okay? Because they can look at it and see that it really did produce the results that they wanted, right? And that's because humans are visual creatures, right? About 80 to 90% of the information we get comes through our eyes. Bats have good hearing, dogs have good smelling. We like images to make decisions. And for at least the guys in the room, I can verify this by all the scantily clad models that come along with just about anything they want to sell you. We're programmed for this. Visuals are processed about 60,000 times faster than text. Right? So if I were to ask you to imagine what I'm talking about from an infinite set of points that are equidistant around a particular point, you really are talking about a circle, right? And seeing that circle is so much faster to understand. So, this is why we want to be able to use those tests and say, is everything kind of correct? Right? When we're presented with this stuff, we're not looking through the logs and the features and all that stuff. We're able to visually see it. And this is kind of what it looks like. Filling in the phone number, checking availability. Okay, so this is actually one of those things I developed for that for Vonage, right? To give them an idea of what that looks like. And the side benefit by doing it this way also is that when things fail, people get to see what it is that was failed. You're saving a trip to the debugger, right? So we want to make sure that our developers, in the same way that we assert stuff, where they don't have to go back and see values, can look at it visually as well to understand what it is that went wrong. And then finally, make sure that you use and trust the three amigos, right? As a review, business person, talking about what's and whys, developers to make sure that things can be implemented and validate that the abstractions are correct, testers to make sure we don't forget stuff, right? These guys form a really tight and very efficient a team, okay, to actually build software from, right? Very small number of people in reality, no friggin' meetings to schedule and go to, right? Because there's two things in my life that I really hate, which are siloed development and meetings, or unneeded meetings. Okay, you're probably still going to need a couple of them, but I still hate them, right? Three Amigos really gets away with that stuff because the stuff that otherwise you'd have to have a meeting to go discuss a particular requirement, you do it. You actually put together a very tight, precise, executable way of saying what the requirement really is, right? It's really useful paradigm, one that helps produce high-performance teams. Now, I asked this of somebody this morning, okay, because I was going to use, so who knows what Alka-Seltzer is? This is more than I thought, okay. So I was going to tap out the Alka-Seltzer thing, and then I used Jingle Bells, and you got it. Right. 1972, there was a commercial, maybe you saw it, maybe you haven't, for Alka-Seltzer. Let me play that commercial. And by the way, my hypothesis is that the Three Amigos are the Alka-Seltzer requirements training. So if you substitute that every time you hear Alka-Seltzer in the ad, you'll see what I mean.
Came to this little place, waiter says, try this, you'll like it. What's this? Try it, you'll like it. But what is try it, you'll like it? So I tried it. Thought I was gonna die. Took 2 Alka-Seltzer.
Alka-Seltzer neutralizes all the acid your stomach has churned out. For your upset stomach and headache, take Alka-Seltzer and feel better fast.
Alka-Seltzer works. Try it, you'll like it.
Three Amigos work. Try it, you'll like it. All right, time to wrap up. And then we can get to actually some questions. So, as a review, Cucumber is really about communications. It has a side benefit of testing, right? Part of the reason that it's communicative is that we use a domain-specific language, so it's unambiguous when we're talking about what it is that we're talking about. Got to make sure that we're declarative, not imperative. Right? Talk about what it is, not how you do it, basically is what you can think about. Oh, we're going to say that. Treat your tests like code. Check them in, refactor them. Make sure that all the tests are repeatable, just like code. Right? Quickly give, always think about giving something to the developers so they don't have to go back into the debugger to try to recreate a failure. Right? I'm not telling you to get good at defect remediation. What I'm really telling you is get good at not making defects. Okay, Selenium testing is getting very popular. It's also kind of hard, there's repeatability, fragility, asynchronicity issues. None of those are insurmountable. Some of them are a little ugly though, right? So start thinking about before and after hooks. I should also say, one of the things that I like doing, I'm using browsers, is make them into singletons, because it's usually a very expensive thing to do. So my before stuff will make sure that my singleton is initialized, right? Use page objects, fluent weights, help you solve some of those issues. All right? 3 amigos are definitely the way to go. Try it, you'll like it. Finally, cucumber testing is much more than having QA people write some givens, whens, and thens, right? And letting developers figure it out. It's going to take some work, right? But the results get to be very stunning by the time you're done with it. So, thank you very much. So long. Thanks for all the fish. Extra bonus points if you remember that book. Douglas Adams. Now it's time for questions, answers, debate, and we finally depart to lunch. So thank you very much. And the store is open for talking. Because you've been a very quiet crowd. Questions? Hi guys, we got a good 7 minutes before lunch. Yes?
Well, I mean, I use SpecFlow.
Yep.
I've got a website
Mhm.
where I've implemented Cucumber and maybe not as finely as you have explained, but
Mhm.
maybe I can make it a little better.
Sure.
Is there any way to work Cucumber with the desktop applications?
Selenium is for browser testing.
Yes, that's right. But
Yeah.
is there any way, because Cucumber is like a
Yeah.
superficial level.
Yeah, you can do anything in Cucumber.
Yeah, but I mean, is there anything that would replace Selenium for desktop apps?
I don't know of any
Use
released
Windows
pieces.
automation, can't you?
Yeah,
It's like a whole Windows API built into Windows that allows you to.
yeah. I mean, I've actually used Selenium, but it's the same idea, testing iOS apps, right? Because those are actually native apps, but because of the accessibility layer, you're able to get to them, off of, an HTML, access. So I bet that it's the same thing. I haven't looked at the recent copies of .NET for native apps. I'd be very surprised if there isn't something that does that. Becoming like a paradigm. And I don't know, how do you go about it? I mean, the web.
I haven't actually done it, but
Yeah.
you can use Windows automation. There's like an API built into .NET framework that allows you to do things with dialogues and filling bits in.
Yeah, it's probably the same sort of issues. So, again, when I was doing this kind of stuff, and these were acceptance tests, for iOS. The only difference with that kind of stuff is that, you get to run them on simulators. Eventually you have to run them on real hardware. Same sort of issue as different browsers, even though they're native apps, right? You got to test them 24 ways and probably more against the middle because, iOS isn't just like one monolithic release. There's a release that's applicable to this kind of a device with those kind of characteristics for display, this kind of device. It's a mess. You want to test back compatibility. Same kind of issues though. But anyhow, I don't know of the framework for you. I'm sure it can be figured out though. Sounds like it's already been figured out. Yeah, I mean, presentation framework is supposed to give you that kind of addressability. Good question. See, I don't know all the answers. I'm the first to admit that. No? Nobody else? Yeah, keep going then. Yeah, you're doing good.
No, I mean, regarding fluent weight
Yes.
that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I mean, in Java, I think in .NET, the spec flow doesn't have,
Yeah.
it does have a fluent version. But I think in Java there is wait until, and then you specify the event that you're waiting on.
That's-
You don't have to specify.
But that you're going to have to use a event firing WebDriver to do
Oh
that.
yes, so that's event based and use.
Yeah, and that's hard.
Right.
Like I say, I want to make sure that people use it by not making the implementation too hard. And it's been over a year since I've looked at SpecFlow. I'd be surprised if they're not pulling in some of the other stuff because it's not really SpecFlow that you're asking this of. It's Selenium.
Yeah.
So I can almost guarantee you that it'll work then. That's not platform specific. Yeah. Also, people normally ask me, like, isn't there a better tool than Selenium to use for, testing my apps? And quite honestly, my answer is no. I mean, it's not that money is a big consideration necessarily for me, but I'm pretty happy with the generality of what Selenium does, and it beats the pants off of most of these other, kind of testing systems that you buy from that cost a lot of money.
I've got a question.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Just a final thought. No, you said that Amazon release every 11 seconds.
Yeah, 11.6.
There's no way that they can execute all their tests.
Oh, no, of course not.
So what? How
They're not testing presentation layer stuff at that speed. But what they are doing is actually running continuously, and it's kind of like an overlapping window, right? So they might be releasing every 11.6 seconds. That didn't mean that the test ran inside of 11.6 seconds. It meant that the tests were confirming that they could do a release. Okay, so whatever it takes for them to do it, and again, they're not testing everything all at once. No way. All right, I'm sure that they're actually using, the forbidden fruit of, we never touch that stuff, so we don't have to bother testing it. Don't do that. Right. Yeah, but they're very impressive. They really are. I talked about this yesterday. There's a book that was written by 3 people that were involved in the Hewlett-Packard experiment. It took place from 2008 to 2012, and it's called something about practical large scaling and agile, but I could look up the reference for you. They weren't talking about releasing stuff every 5 times a minute. They had a firmware base that that they had to keep up, that their releases were once every 2 years. Okay, but even more to the point, after they went through a lot of agility and a lot of automated testing and whatnot, the big thing that I took away from it is that they were able to free up their resources to actually work on stuff that just wasn't tech debt ridden. Okay, so they actually got from 5% of their cycles to do new work, okay, that would produce new products and new value to the company, from 5% to 40%. And to me, that was highly important. So yeah, I know it's a great figure to throw out there, though. Probably the Facebook one is more realistic because they actually do full regression testing quickly. Yeah.
Any way to make the slides available to us?
Sure. The slides are, I know that I uploaded them yesterday. There's one minor mistake that I fixed this morning. So I left out a then in that first slide of things to get better with. Yeah, but don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. So they're uploaded to these, DevWeek guys. I put all my stuff up on slideshare.net. Okay, so you always find anything that I present up there. I guess now it's part of my LinkedIn stuff. I said, I might as well turn that on too. So yeah, I encourage you to link in with me. Or you could go to www.dinersoft.com and you'll see all the things that I do, along with my business card. Well, you've been a quiet audience, but quiet isn't bad. So do enjoy the rest of the conference, run into me, and talk. Thank you very much.